Hello, and thank you for taking the time to listen to this presentation. As a genealogist, my focus is always the people who live in a place, and the census returns are one of my favourite sources. But I often wonder how accurate the occupation of scholar was for children. Did they really attend school on a daily basis, or even a Sunday school? By the end of this presentation, I hope to have given you some ideas on where to look for evidence that the census entry of scholar or student really did mean regular attendance at school, which might help you follow your young ancestor as they may have walked to school. I am going to focus on the 1851 to 1921 timeframe, and my examples will be from the market town of Wimborne Minster, located in East Dorset on the south coast of England. Although there was a voluntary 1851 education census, this is the only reference I'll be making to it, as very few of the schedules have survived. Its aim had been to identify any household where education took place, but not to name individuals. The few surviving records, for those who are interested, can be found in TNA, the National Archives, under reference HO 129. The 19th century was full of debates as to how to increase the general level of education within the population. A genuine effort to increase the level of education started between 1808 and 1811 with the establishment of national and British schools, aiming to have at least a school in every parish. This helped move the general provision of education from Sunday schools to day schools, and saw education for the masses start to be viewed as more than just being able to read. The creation of new schools was greatly increased after the 1833 Factory Act, whereby government grants became available for the building of new schools. It was this act that required children under the age of 13 to receive 2 hours of elementary schooling per day. For those aged between 9 and 13, that could have been on top of an 8-hour working day. The 1870 Education Act provided a further boost to the provision of school buildings by establishing school boards to build schools where none were available through churches or charities. Pressure for free and compulsory education for all children was promoted by both the National Education League and the National Educational Union. Both had been created in 1869, the key difference between the two being whether the curriculum should include religious education. Education for 5 to 10-year-olds finally became compulsory in 1880, but attendance was relatively low as education was not free until most fees were abolished in 1891, although it took until 1918 for all school fees in state schools to be abolished. When the school leaving age was raised to 11 in 1893, compulsory education was extended to blind and deaf children, and when in 1899 the school leaving age rose to 12, compulsory education was extended to any physically impaired children. The school leaving age rose again in 1918 to 14, and a provision was made for those aged 14 to 18 and in work to continue with their education. It was not until 1944, when the school leaving age rose to 15, that secondary education was made free to all. The 1851 census included a new instruction to the householders. Against the name of children aged 5 years or above, if daily attending school or receiving regular tuition under a master or governess at home, the householder was supposed to write scholar, and in the last case, where people were being educated at home, at home. At this time, all children under the age of 13 were supposed to receive at least 2 hours of education per day. In the top example, you can see that the local Baptist minister had one child attending school, and his two youngest children were educated at home. If you're unfortunate enough to be one of the inhabitants of the Wimborne Workhouse in 1851, you would have been educated in the workhouse schoolroom and supervised by 23-year-old Diana Clark, indicated in the middle image. And she would have been responsible for instructing the children in reading, writing, and arithmetic, as well as the principles of a religious education. By 1861, there were two schoolmistresses in the workhouse, although by 1871 they were back to having only one schoolmistress. The six pupils at the six pupils at Sophia Clark's Ladies' School in the bottom image are clearly attending a boarding school. The instructions to the census enumerator or to households did not change significantly until 1911. In 1911, the census made the distinction between anyone under the age of 10 still at school, whose occupation was to be given as school, and a student who was anyone over the age of 10 who attended college, evening school, or other instructional classes. If studying for a profession, that also was to be stated, such as law student or medical student. If attendance was only half or less of the normal school day, this was supposed to have been recorded by adding part-time to school or student. If an individual was employed alongside their studies, that was also to have been recorded. Entries could have read, for example, school, errand boy, or school, part-time, errand boy, depending on the education-employment balance. The school leaving age had been 12 since 1899, but clearly there was some flexibility as to when and where that education occurred. The top image shows that while John Ludlow Hannam attended a school, his younger sister was educated privately, as she was recorded as a student, or possibly someone was confused as to exactly what should have been recorded. The younger brother has no entry or a correction made by the enumerator, but as he was 9, he should have been in full-time education. The middle image lets us know that 17-year-old Henry Charles Law was studying for a profession, in this case architecture. The final image shows George Legg attended school part-time while also being employed as a draper's errand boy. The 1921 census simplified the recording of attending school or some form of continuing education to whole-time and part-time. The underlying assumption was that those at school whole-time did not have time for employment, but those attending part-time would also have a form of substantial employment. By this time, the school leaving age was 14, and there was provision for individuals to continue their education part-time alongside working until 18. The top census image is unusual in that it not only recorded that Reginald Valentine Borough attended school whole-time, but gave the name of the school he attended, Wimborne Grammar School. The middle image tells us that Gladys Goughlike attended the municipal school part-time, but does not indicate if she was also employed, while the final image reveals that Kenneth M. Kerridge was articled to an architect and surveyor in Chancery Lane, but not where he was attending classes part-time. There are two instances where it's relatively easy to identify which school a child in full-time education is attending. Firstly, those attending a boarding school. The head of household was usually a headmaster or headmistress, and the boarder's relationship to the head of household was given as student or pupil, with many of the places of birth being outside the immediate area. Schools which had boarders could include public schools, private schools, industrial schools, and reform schools. Secondly, if a child was listed as living at the workhouse on a census, they would most likely have been attending the school attached to the workhouse. If your student is also a lodger, it may be that they attended a local boarding school, but they lodged outside the school as its available rooms were full. Alternatively, they may have been a young adult scholar training for a profession. This then leaves the vast majority of those in education who are clearly living at home, and it takes further investigation to identify likely schools. My first stop is usually the local directories, as between the town description and the individual paid for entries, most schools are likely to be listed. The 1851 Hunt and Co's directory, in the description of Wimborne Minster, Dorset, has the comment, "Besides the grammar school, there is a large one upon the national system, erected in 1843. Yet when the section for schools is checked, alongside the free grammar and national schools, there is a British school, two schools run by women, a boarding school run by a man, and an infant school, although Sophia Clark does not seem to have paid for an entry." The 1911 Kelly's directory only mentions the technical institution in the description of Wimborne Minster, and under the schools section, just two elementary schools are listed alongside the grammar school. You have to read through the commercial entries to identify that Mrs. Mary Clark had a girls' school in Grove Road and Miss Susie Funnell had a ladies' school in Eastborough. The 1911 entries are much more detailed, giving a snapshot of the teachers and the size of the schools. Newspapers. In these examples, the Dorset County Chronicle can also be useful to identify schools through adverts such as the two examples, or key events at the schools such as the National Schools Annual Treat or Prize Givings. The August 1889 prize giving took up a whole newspaper column naming many students and also giving an insight into how the school was run, from problems with water supplies to changes in the curriculum. In July 1875, nearly 4.5 columns reported on an investigation into the future regulations of the grammar school. Maps are incredibly useful for identifying local schools, especially if the school you're looking for is no longer standing or used as a school. The 1887 Ordnance Survey map of Wimborne had three schools clearly marked: Queen Elizabeth's Free Grammar School, above it a school which was the National School or Boys Elementary School, and thirdly, next to St John's Church, the Mixed Elementary and Infant School. You can use Google Street View to walk the streets and see the buildings today, although this is not possible for all schools, as some, particularly in cities, were destroyed by bombings or pulled down as part of urban regeneration projects. It's also worth noting that a lot of rural schools have now become private dwellings, as has the Wimborne Grammar School. I've already mentioned using directories, many which can be found online at Leicester University Special Collections. Alternatively, local study libraries often hold copies. My favourite site for maps is the National Library of Scotland, which has made an extensive range of historic maps available online. When looking for school websites, ideally you're looking for ones that focus on the history of the school, such as the Old Winburnians for Wimborne Grammar School. Although you might want to contact the current school office to know, for example, if there is a World War Roll of Honour in the school, or if they have retained any historical documents. Although if they have any, although if any have survived, they are more likely to have been sent to the county archive. Not all counties have an online parish clerk, but where one does exist, details on schools may not yet be included, but they may be an alternative source for directories. Local history societies and local museums are always a source of quality local information, but it will depend on their focus as to how much information on schools they have. The Museum of East Dorset in Wimborne has relatively recently deposited material they had for the national schools with the County Archive, Dorset History Centre. The local county archive is the most likely place to hold any surviving school documents, which can include admission registers, logbooks, governors and inspectors' reports, as well as sundry planning applications and bills. The most useful document to a genealogist are the administration are the admission registers. For Wimborne Grammar School, these exist from 1849 to 1915. If the scholar was recorded as living at the workhouse, you would want to research for that institution's records. Again, they tend to be held in the local county archive. Comparatively few admission registers are online, but it is an area which Ancestry and Find My Past particularly are increasingly focusing on, as the 100-year closure rule is slowly allowing more of these documents to be released into the public domain. When moving from the census to school, there are three key questions to help focus research. Understanding the legal requirements will help establish what the entries such as scholar or student next to a child or young person might mean. If your relative is not at a boarding school or workhouse, you will need to identify which schools existed locally at the time. Although the larger town or city, the more schools you may have to consider. I certainly know that members of my family travel relatively long distances to and from home every day to attend specific religious schools in London. Finally, you can start searching for records of the school, either ones which name individuals, such as admission registers and newspaper reports, or ones which give an insight into how the school operated, such as logbooks and reports. Thank you for your time, and feel free to contact me via info@penguingenealogy.co.uk if you have any questions.